Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Sorrow in Our Heart, The Life of Tecumseh, by Allan W. Eckert, narrated by Paul Heitsch. When a white man kills an Indian in a fair fight, it is called honorable, but when an Indian kills a white man in a fair fight, it is called murder. When a white army battles Indians and wins, it is called a great victory, but if they lose, it is called a massacre, and bigger armies are raised. If the Indian flees before the advance of such armies, when he tries to return, he finds that white men are living where he lived. If he tries to fight off such armies, he is killed, and the land is taken anyway. When an Indian is killed, it is a great loss, which leaves a gap in our people and a sorrow in our heart. When a white is killed, 3 or 4 others step up to take his place, and there is no end to it. The white man seeks to conquer nature, to bend it to his will, and to use it wastefully until it is all gone, and then he simply moves on, leaving the waste behind him and looking for new places to take. The whole white race is a monster who is always hungry, and what he eats is land. Tecumseh, elder brother of Tecumseh, to Tecumseh, March 19, 1779. Prologue. March 9, 1768. Wednesday. The man who stood silently, patiently, in the lengthening shadows at the water's edge was in no manner physically remarkable, except perhaps for his eyes. There was a singular keenness about them, imbuing a quick and penetrating gaze that belied the passivity of his pose. As always, they missed little of his surroundings, and nothing that moved. These were the eyes of Tecumseh, war chief of the Shawnee nation. At the moment he was gazing across the pool, through the faint mist rising from the surface of the water, at the little half-faced shelter erected several hours ago, listening intently for the sound that would ease his concern. But everything was still. He chose to take the silence as benign. Had Methotassa's distress increased, someone would have emerged from the shelter and informed him. On the other hand, the absence of sound indicated the birth had not yet occurred. He had urged his wife to remain behind at their village, promising that he and his followers would return as swiftly as possible following the important council to be held at the capital city of the Shawnee tribe. She, however, insisted on coming along, certain there would be plenty of time for them to reach their destination well before her labor began. They had almost done so. The large delegation of Kispokotha Shawnees had left their own village, Kispoko Town, on the Scioto River, some 70 miles southeast of here 4 days ago, taking their time on the easy trail leading to the tribe's principal village of Chalogatha. There had been an early thaw, and the snow that had cloaked the ground for a week or more was largely melted away. The procession they had made was a colorful one, almost everyone wrapped in his own brightly hued blanket or garbed in furs to ward off the chill. In the van were the foremost chiefs and some of the warriors astride horses, followed by more warriors afoot, and then in succession by the old men, the women, and the children. 600 individuals, representing about 2/3 of Kispoko Town's population, had elected to attend the Grand Council at Chalogatha, and as the sinuous file made its way northwestward, the air was filled with the laughter of the men, the almost incessant chattering and giggling of the women, and the squeals and happy cries of the children, the latter rarely keeping to the path, and covering half again the distance of each day's march by romping through the woods and prairies, playing follow the leader and archery games, tag and mock battles, as the procession moved. On the first night they had camped on the rim of the north branch of Paint Creek and built their multitude of evening cook fires, with half a dozen or more family groups clustered about each of the fires, though with a great deal of intermingling occurring. By early morning hours the temperature had plummeted to well below freezing, and the wind whipped them unmercifully. Methotassah, still exhausted from the previous day's 15-mile walk, had begun showing signs of distress, and, over her objections, Tecumseh had bundled her well in blankets and placed her upon his own horse, which he led. The column of travelers was much more compacted this day, and there was little straying or game playing by the children. Late in the afternoon they made their second camp about 12 miles from the first, along the main course of Paint Creek. Numerous hasty shelters had been constructed in which the blanket-wrapped people huddled close together near the fires for mutual warmth. The weather had continued unpleasant yesterday, with several brief periods of snow pelting into their faces, and camp last night had been made on the headwaters of a small stream about a dozen miles southeast of Chilagotha. This bitter cold snap broke during the night, and by mid-morning the temperature was well above freezing, the sky bright blue, without a trace of clouds. In the early afternoon, Methetassa's water had broken, and her distress increased as labor pains struck. She did not complain, and withstood them for some time as they endeavored to reach Chilagotha, now so close. But it was not to be. When within 3 good arrow flights of the town, as they were passing the spring and pool, it had become clear she could not travel or even be carried farther. Pucksinwah called a halt, summoned his second-in-command, Shemeneto, Black Snake, and directed him to lead their followers on the remaining march to Chilagotha. When he arrived, Shemeneto should report his chief's whereabouts with the promise that Pucksinwah would arrive in time for the opening of the council at midday tomorrow. At the edge of this pool, formed by the bubbling spring, the shelter was quickly built. 6 women, midwives, referred to as aunts, stayed behind to assist Methetassa in the birth, and also remaining were the 2 older children of Pucksinwah and Methetassa, 12-year-old Chiksika and 10-year-old Tecumseh. As much as Pucksinwah had wanted to reach Chilagotha today and spend this evening counseling with other chiefs in preparation for the beginning of the Grand Council tomorrow, his greater concern at this moment was with Methetassa. It was a difficult time for her, more so than with the previous births, and he wondered if it was because 10 years had passed since the birth of Tecumseh, without another child being born. The war chief's features softened as he thought of his wife, remembering the first time he had ever seen her, and how smitten he had been with her, despite the stress of the circumstances. 15 harvest moons had come and gone since then, yet the details were etched in his mind with indelible clarity. He had been a young man of 26 then, one of the best young warriors in the entire tribe, and he had been chosen by his fellows to lead a war party against the Cherokees living on the Shawnee River, practically in the area where his own people had once lived and after whom the river had been named. It was here that they had met, and, through Pucksinwah's skillful attack plan, defeated a much larger party of Cherokees at their village. Several Cherokee men had been killed, and 4 taken captive along with 12 women and children. Among these was a slim and very attractive girl of 15 who was captured by Oshashqua, Muskrat, the oldest member of their war party, who discovered her hiding in a pile of furs that were being bound into bundles for transport. This was Methetassa, a turtle laying her eggs in the sand. The victorious Shawnees took the prisoners, as well as the furs and other village plunder, to their distant, well-hidden camp, and that evening the 4 captive Cherokee warriors were tortured to death. Before that occurred, Pucksinwah, concerned especially for the terrified Methetassa, directed Oshashqua to take the women and children away from the camp and return with them in the morning. This was done, and Pucksinwah remained solicitous of her comfort and safety on the return to Ohio. Oshashqua was of the Pequot sept, and after their arrival, Methetassa, as his captive, was taken by him to his own village of Pequot Town on the Mad River. There she was officially adopted by Oshashqua and his wife to take the place of their son, a young warrior who was killed on his very first raid against the Cherokees the year before. With this adoption, she became part of the Kagilewilani, the Turtle Unsoma. Pucksinwah, in his own village of Kispoko Town, could not forget the attractive girl, and, when not away leading frequent war raids into enemy territory, made occasional trips to see her at Oshashqua's house in Pequot Town. By the time she had been with the Shawnees for just over a year, he was paying much attention to her, and at the next feast dance, in the late spring of 1755, She signified her acceptance of him by shyly slipping her bare hand into his, and they were soon married. Early the following summer, Tecumseh was born at Kisboko town, and, as Pucksinwah himself had done, spent his early boyhood playing games and learning the fundamentals of becoming a warrior on the broad plains of the Scioto Valley. And this was also where, 2 years later, Tecumseh had been born. A movement at the shelter broke Pucksinwah's reverie, and his gaze sharpened. One of the ants had emerged into the final rays of the setting sun, and for a moment his pulse quickened. But she didn't head toward him. She merely stooped and picked up some of the firewood that Tecumseh had been piling up outside the blanket-covered entryway, and disappeared with it back into the shelter. Pucksinwah frowned faintly again, wishing that Metatasa had not insisted on making the trip, and praying silently to Moneto and the Great Spirit to care for her now. As he had done on several introspective moments recently, the war chief considered the wisdom of bringing another son into this turbulent world. That the babe to be born this day would be a boy he had no doubt whatever. Somehow, with the prescience that he had always known, and that had saved him on innumerable occasions, he knew the child would be male. In his envisioning, however, there was no clear picture or feeling of how Metatasa would fare in this birth, and that worried him. Tecumseh stepped out of the woods with another large armload of firewood and headed for the shelter. Pucksinwah smiled as he watched. The boy was tall for his age and lean, yet well-muscled and very sure in his movements. Already, in his games with the other boys, he was exhibiting impressive early signs of leadership. There was character and strength, and Pucksinwah was very proud of him. Yet what lay in store for him and for his as-yet unborn little brother in the years to come? Pucksinwah sighed and watched as Tecumseh dropped his load on the pile, and then listened carefully as one of the ants stuck her head out past the blanket and said something to him. The boy nodded and set out again to seek a final load of firewood in the gathering twilight. The smile lingered on Pucksinwah's lips, but tinged now with a sense of sadness. There was a time when he would have cherished the vision of Tecumseh's future, and that of the little one to come. Stalwart young men proud of their heritage as the fiercest and finest warriors among all the Indians, boldly making forays against enemy tribes in the Shawnee tradition, exhibiting great bravery and fighting skill coupled with keen intelligence, and returning home as their father had done before them, with the well-deserved honors of war. But that was no longer the complete vision. Now there was a new and deadly element, more to be feared and reckoned with than any danger the Shawnees had ever faced in their history. The whites. That was what this Grand Council at Chalagatha was all about, trying to decide what the Shawnees must do as a nation about the whites who were crossing the eastern mountains and spilling into this land of the Indians, bringing with them the ever more certain seeds of destruction. Individually, these whites were as nothing, generally poor as fighting men because they had no training as warriors, largely cowardly and almost always deceitful, never a match for even half their number in Shawnee braves. Yet these whites were armed with weapons infinitely superior to bows, knives, and war clubs, killing the Indians as well by the pestilences brought among them as by the drawing of blood, destroying without care the beasts and birds of forest and field that the Great Spirit had endowed to her red children, cutting down stately woodlands and burning vast prairie expanses, damming free-running streams to build their mills for grinding grain and, worst of all, driving stakes into the breast of Mother Earth, building fences and setting apart as their own land that the Great Spirit had bestowed to all. Pucksinwah's sudden shiver was inspired as much by his bleak thoughts as by the increasing coldness of the evening air. He stepped to a nearby log and sat upon it, tucking his blanket more snugly about himself. Since first the whites had come, there had been troubles, and with each passing year the problems had intensified. What a wonderful time it must have been before whites set foot in these lands, and warfare was a clean and sharply defined, even joyful, intertribal matter. The Shawnee war chief remembered his own youth when the tribal historians spoke of those days long past, implanting the proud history of their tribe in the minds of the youngsters seated around the fire. Such tribal historians were carefully selected and intensively trained over a period of years with no other goal than to pass on to these rising generations that which was the truth of what was past, without embellishment, without amendment, without personal bias, always with incredible accuracy and, at the same time, instilling in their listeners a fierce and lasting pride in and for their own people. And the history of the Shawnees was, indeed, a colorful one. Unlike virtually all the other tribes which sank their roots in a specified territory and remained there, the Shawnees were astonishingly nomadic, traveling, warring, moving, pausing, then traveling again, red leaves drifting and eddying on the tide of time. More than this, they were extremely bellicose and not infrequently mercenary. They were a warrior race who reveled in the sheer joy of fighting and were masters in the art of warfare. They were frequently invited and often temporarily accepted such invitations by tribes of lesser war-making capabilities to settle among them, share in the bounty of their harvests, and protect them if and when their enemies swooped down upon them, or even to launch their own raids into the territories of the foes and their hosts. The history of the tribe, as relayed by the tribal historians to the wide-eyed listeners gathered around the fire, told many stories of great heroism and courage, tales of alliances and enmities, all becoming more focused, more detailed, and more accurate the more modern they became. There were almost always good relations with such tribes as the Hurons and the Eries, the Susquehannocks and the Lenni Lenape and the Twituis, along with many other tribes in the area of the western Great Lakes. There were rarely good feelings, however, between them and the northeastern tribes, the Oneidas and Onondagas, the Mohawks and Senecas and Cayugas. So harshly did the Shawnees deal with them that they eventually banded themselves together in a confederation for self-protection, which some called Haudenosaunee, meaning the United People, and others called the Haudenosaunee, meaning People of the Long House. But these names quickly gave way to a more common name, the Iroquois League, the Poisonous Snakes. Also called the Five Nations, the Iroquois became among the most avowed enemies of the Shawnees, jealous of their strength, mobility, and skill in warfare. Their own reputation as a force powerful enough to face the Shawnees was augmented considerably when, while the majority of the Shawnees were away, some in the South, some in Missouri country, and only a small number in the Ohio Valley, the Iroquois went to war against their powerful and numerous neighbors, the Hurons. The latter, because of their strength, numbers, and pacific attitude, had long been respectfully referred to by other tribes as grandfather, signifying wisdom and superiority. Huron-Iroquois warfare was sporadic for nearly the entire first half of the last century, gradually intensifying when the new French settlers in the St. Lawrence Valley decided, at the behest of their proselytizing black-robed Jesuits, to support the Hurons. In doing so, they acquired the enmity of the Iroquois. It was, so the tribal historians told Pucksinwah and other listeners, in 1649, when something occurred that stretched the Iroquois' reputation as fighters well beyond all reality and caused lasting ramifications for the Shawnees, who were not even involved. A large force of Iroquois warriors fought and defeated a considerably smaller party of Hurons. The surviving Hurons, being hotly pursued, took temporary refuge with an insignificant tribe called the Eries, the Cat People, who occupied a small pocket of territory near the southeastern end of the lake named after them. When the Iroquois tracked the Hurons there and approached, the latter fled and escaped to their own people. The enraged Iroquois instantly retaliated against the virtually defenseless Eries, utterly destroyed their villages, then tracked down and murdered every man, woman, and child until the entire tribe was annihilated. It was hardly a great feat of warfare, yet it substantially bolstered their reputation as wholly savage killers, and the fear evoked among neighboring tribes was practically unbounded. The Iroquois relished the reputation, and were delighted that now whole enemy villages were precipitately abandoned when the cry was raised, "The Iroquois are coming." As if to cement their newfound notoriety, the Iroquois descended on another small tribe, the benign neutrals to the north and west of them, and similarly wiped them out. Once again, the reputation of the Iroquois expanded. Few outsiders seemed to notice that the boastful Iroquois were sagacious enough to avoid any outright confrontation with the Hurons or their Shawnee and Delaware allies, unless the advantage for the Five Nations was enormous. Prior to and throughout this period, the tribal historians related, the white men came from across the great blue water to the east, from Spain first, establishing themselves in northeastern Florida, and then spreading out in exploratory parties wearing queer metal hats and chest plates, and penetrating quickly to the southern domain of the Shawnees along the river named for them, the Shawnee. Then came the French and British, also in gigantic canoes pushed by the wind, first planting settlements along the coast of the great eastern water, but quickly pushing inland and establishing contact with the Indians, bringing with them a mixed blessing, tools, materials, and weapons that catapulted the Indians out of their primitive existence and into a modern age and, in so doing, made them dependent upon the whites. For the furs the Indians could trade to the whites, they received in return wonderful steel knives and hatchets, blankets, tools, fabrics, paint, clothing, steel traps, condiments, cookware, spices, a variety of hardware, and the two most important and society-altering items of all, liquor and guns. Invariably, the liquor was gone almost immediately after it was received, with nothing to show for it except the upset and often mayhem it caused, and the guns were dependent upon the powder and lead they required. Now the competition for the Indian trade became sharp between the different white factions, especially between the British and French, and evolved into a vicious series of conflicts loosely called the Beaver Wars. Of those two principal white factions, the British were far more deadly in their ultimate goals. French traders closely intermingled with the Indians, quite often married into their tribes and adopted their culture, but their trade goods were markedly inferior to those the British had to offer, much higher priced and considerably less abundant. The British traders, on the other hand, with their superb, highly varied, seemingly endless supply of goods, could provide the Indians handily with everything they wanted. But they created more resentment among the natives in the process than did the French. British traders, even when among the tribes, largely kept to themselves, by and large considering them inferior races of ignorant savages incapable of social graces, and subhuman in their sensitivity and emotions. They treated the Indians abominably in many circumstances, flagrantly cheated them in their dealings, and supplied them with far too much liquor, which, in effect, gave them nothing of lasting value for their work. Worst of all, the British traders served as the vanguard for a wave of settlers who followed and laid claim to Indian lands, without respect or regard to the beauties and intricacies of nature, raping the very land they took in their ravenous desire to possess. Pucksinwah could still hear the tribal historians telling how this was only the beginning of the problem. The British committed themselves to a strong alliance with the Iroquois, believing that Confederation's ridiculous claims of having been victorious in warfare over all enemies, and accepting, without question, the Iroquois claim of being the most powerful body of Indians on the continent. When the English soon discovered that this belief was false, they deliberately set about convincing themselves and others that all other tribes were mere subjects of the Iroquois and bound by whatever decisions or treaties the Five Nations consummated. They did this primarily because they wanted to possess the land and its great natural wealth, and they were quite willing to buy it from the Iroquois League, even though most often it was land the Iroquois neither owned nor controlled. And the Iroquois were more than willing to make a very good living by selling to the gullible whites any land they wanted, so long as it wasn't actual Iroquois territory. If these whites then became involved in disputes with the other tribes who hereditarily possessed the lands the Iroquois had sold, then that was their problem. Although if the price was right, the Iroquois would lend the British their warrior strength to help back up their claims of having legally purchased the lands. Little wonder, then, that the injured tribes turned to the powerful mercenary Shawnees as defenders of their own rights. The whites, recognizing that the greatest danger they might have to face was the possibility of all red men uniting against them, considered it vital to foment bitter intertribal unrest, even between longtime allies, so that the entire frontier and the wilderness beyond was in a state of constant unrest and eruption. The cream of manhood of all the tribes was whittled away in the small and large conflicts that resulted, and tribes that had once been powerful found themselves severely weakened, and all the more dependent upon the whites they had initially welcomed and aided, and who, while still squabbling for dominance in America, had now become virtually their masters. There were those tribes who strove to stay neutral, but even they were not spared the devastating results of contact with the whites. Whole tribes, particularly those in the far eastern regions of the continent, were wiped out of existence by the diseases the whites brought among them: smallpox, measles, chickenpox, mumps, whooping cough, influenza, venereal diseases, and even extremely virulent strains of the common cold. In all this, the Shawnees occupied a unique position. They were fierce, dangerous, unpredictable, and essentially without land of their own to defend, quite willing to fight as mercenaries for this white faction or that, or for none, as the inclination struck them, often with different factions within their own tribe supporting different factions of the whites, and yet, amazingly, never allowing these diverse alliances to become hot warfare among themselves. Their relations with the Five Nations remained consistently terrible, with the Iroquois strutting and boasting and claiming their superiority, and the Shawnees, knowing they had nothing to prove, openly contemptuous of such claims, and considering the greedy Iroquois as merely being the running dogs of the British. French relations with the tribes, excepting the Iroquois and their few allies, remained relatively good, and these whites, recognizing exactly what the British were doing, began in 1671 a concerted effort to thwart the British by taking formal possession of all the territory to the west and northwest of the Ohio River and, over the next half-century, establishing numerous strategically located quasi-military fortifications and fur posts to back up their claims and successfully defend the rich fur trade. With these facilities in place, the grip the French now had on the western country to control the fur trade was peaceful, but very strong. Actually beginning to believe their own reputation for ferocity and supremacy, the Iroquois began, in the 1680s, an effort to extend their actual occupied territory into the Ohio country. The Miamis, though currently the most powerful tribe in the Northwest, suddenly found themselves in the maw of a dangerous pincers, being attacked on the west by their mortal enemies, the Sioux, and now threatened in the east by the Iroquois. In 1683, these Miamis asked the Shawnees for assistance. Accepting with alacrity, the Shawnees joined forces with the Miamis and some of that tribe's Delaware allies, and despite the Iroquois having superior weapons, easily beat back the invading war parties of the Five Nations. The Shawnees asked no immediate payment from the Miamis for helping, but it was a considerable favor owed them now that one day they would collect. The Iroquois, smarting under their humiliating repulsion, returned to their own Mohawk Valley, and then blandly claimed to their British friends to have defeated all the western tribes, who were now their vassals, and all the territory involved where ownership might previously have been questionable was now indisputably Iroquois territory, and would the British care to buy any of it? Not even considering such a claim might be spurious, the British leaped at this golden opportunity and purchased a great deal. Notwithstanding the French claims, the British now also made Western claims of their own. Even while the Western French posts were being built, the great father in England, King Charles II, granted a royal charter to William Penn for the whole region now called Pennsylvania, which was the territory of the Delawares, though claimed by the Iroquois. The Virginia colonial authorities proclaimed that their domain...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?